to the Audio Renaissance Tapes presentation of From Freedom to Slavery, The Rebirth of Tyranny in America. Written by Gerry Spence. Adapted for audio and produced by Tony Hudds. And now, here is Gerry Spence.
Talking about a lofty subject such as freedom is like trying to jump from rock to rock across the creek without getting your feet wet. No matter how you plan your course, you're likely to slip off into the water somewhere. The choice, of course, is whether one wishes to stay on the bank with dry feet or take the risk of wet feet to get to the other side. Doctors called upon to attend the sick cannot prescribe a cure unless they at first are able to diagnose the illness. Even before that, they must detect that the patient is ill. In the case of our freedoms, I can confidently say that the patient is in grave danger. Having said so, and should you agree in whole or in part, we have together taken the first step toward the cure. As for solutions, there are only two kinds, those from outside the self and those from within. The first suggests that we destroy our enemies, that we manipulate or neutralize them, that we discover detours around them, that we suffer their impositions against us, or at last, that we even love them. In any event, the solution acknowledges the existence of outside forces that deter our progress and impede our happiness. On the other hand, there persists the idea, one with which I am in agreement, that solutions are mainly matters of the self, that power vested in others is often irrelevant to our freedom, that the only change essential for the betterment of the human condition is to change within, that we are the fountainhead of power, and that therefore we need not free the world. We need only free ourselves. The problem, however, is not so much in finding solutions as in making the solutions work. Marx, for example, hated the exploitation of the masses, but his solutions, corrupted in their application, resulted in the enslavement of whole nations. Christ also had a good idea, that we love one another. But in the end, his followers proved to be strong on organization, unsurpassed on dogma, supreme on sophistry, but not much on love. They fought endless wars in his name, murdered hordes of the innocent, burned countless women at the stake as witches, bashed in the heads of heathen Indian children, and left the world riddled with fear and with guilt. Freedom in America, as bountiful and precious as it is, has always been a strange conglomerate of the divine and the fanciful. Understanding freedom in America is like listening to a one-armed piano player. His one arm performs not only its assigned task, but painfully attempts to undertake the function of the missing limb. In listening, our minds provide for us whatever our ears do not, the music of the other hand. But after we assess his performance, as admirable as it has been, we know that something is, indeed, missing. Freedom in America works best for those who can afford it. As the fellow says in The Grapes of Wrath, you're just as free as you got the jack to pay for it. It's not as much an idea as it is a commodity. It's not as much a right as a component of commerce. On the other hand, some of us enjoy a state of freedom that never enters even the dreams of those in many other cultures. As I sit warm and comfortably in a studio recording these thoughts, I don't fear intrusion from brown-shirted agents of the government. If I make minimal efforts at compliance with the rules that preserve the power structure, I will likely be left alone, even if I criticize the power structure. I am essentially free to rant and rave and to emit all manner of noxious noise. It is this dichotomy that serves as both our pride and our poison. Today there are, as indeed there have always been, insidious enslaving forces at work in America. Today's emerging tyranny emanates from a new king, from a non-living power center composed at its core of monolithic corporate entities encased and protected by endless layers of governmental bureaucracies. The primary strategy of the new king is to convert all rights, all human energy, all goals, and at last, all humans into commodities. The new king exists solely for commerce. Its lifeblood, its green blood, is money. And its singular mission is profit. The new king's principal means of control is the media that sells us the myths of freedom. That when we doubt reassures us we are free, and that programs us and our children to accept the notion that all human function, all human desires, indeed, even immortality itself, can at last be satisfied at the marketplace. I'm not against religion, nor am I against commerce. I am, however, reluctant to offer solutions. If the church has anything to do with it, those who offer solutions outside the scriptures will be condemned to eternal hell. If government has anything to do with it, any sound idea will be consumed in the bureaucracy, and the author will be labeled an enemy of the state and disemboweled in one fashion or another. If corporate America has anything to do with it, any ideas that threaten its power will be branded as leftist, or commie, or un-American, and the author of such reform banished as a heretic against the most sacred of all religions in America, free enterprise. At last I've tired of the issue as well as these arguments. If this collection of free-floating thoughts about freedom is to have any efficacy, it will come from freely saying what is on my mind, saying it as well as I can. And if a solution seems to appear, well, why not give it recognition? And if no solutions seem at hand, well, I was never born to solve all of the world's problems, and those who tried were either fools or martyrs. Sometimes it is easier for a poor man to tolerate his corns than to go barefoot and discard the shoes that caused them. Despite the existence of sharp rocks and cockleburs, there's something magical about a boy's barefooted freedom. If only we could convince the world leaders not to walk in each other's shoes, but instead to meet and to talk to each other in their bare feet. Likely, the people as well as the earth would benefit immensely. I think, therefore, I shall walk barefooted herein. I think I shall walk wherever my feet will take me. I hope you'll come too. The first steps on our journey will take us to the trial of Randy Weaver. It's a story that's not been heretofore told anywhere. I want to tell it to you now as I tried it and as I lived it. The blood hadn't cooled on Ruby Ridge before the national media announced that I had taken the defense of Randy Weaver. All hell broke loose. My sister decried my defense of this so-called racist. Letters to the editors in several papers expressed their disappointment that I would lend my services to a person with Weaver's beliefs. I believed then, as I believe now, that Randy Weaver was wrong. His relationship to mankind was wrong. He was perhaps legally wrong when he failed to appear and defend himself in court on a charge of possessing illegal firearms. But the first wrong was not his, nor was the first wrong the government's. The first wrong was ours. In this country, we embrace the myth that we are still a democracy, when we know that we are not a democracy, that we are not free, that the government does not serve us, but subjugates us. We know the government is no longer the servant of the people, but at last has become the people's master. We have stood by like timid sheep while the wolf killed, first the weak, then the strays, then those on the outer edges of the flock, until at last the entire flock belonged to the wolf. We did not care about the weak or about the strays. They were not part of the flock. But as the wolf worked its way toward the center of the flock, we discovered that we were now on the outer edges. Now we must look the wolf squarely in the eye, that we did not do so when the first of us was ripped and torn and eaten, was the first wrong. It was our wrong. That none of us have felt responsible for having lost our freedom has been a part of an insidious progression. In the beginning, the attention of the flock was directed not to the marauding wolf, but to our own deviant members within the flock. We did not care when the wolf took them. We argued that they deserved it. Indeed, the wolf cleansed the herd by destroying the weak and dismembering the aberrant element within. As time went by, strangely, the herd felt more secure under the rule of the wolf. It believed that by belonging to this wolf, it would remain safe from all of the other wolves. But we were eaten just the same. Americans whose battle cry was once, "Give me liberty or give me death," have sat placidly by as a new king was crowned. In America, a new king was crowned by the shrug of our shoulders when our neighbors were wrongfully seized. A new king was crowned when we capitulated to a regime that was no longer sensitive to the people, but to non-people, to corporations, to money, and to power. A new king was crowned when we turned our heads as the poor and the forgotten and the damned were rendered mute and defenseless, not because they were evil, but because, in the scheme of our lives, they seemed unimportant. Not because they were essentially dangerous, but because they were essentially powerless. The new king was crowned when we cheered the government on as it prosecuted the progeny of our ghettos and filled our prisons with black men whose first crime was that they were born in the ghettos. We cheered the new king on as it diluted our right to be secure in our homes against unlawful searches and secure in the courts against unlawful evidence. We cheered the new king on because we were told that our sacred rights were but loopholes by which our enemies, the murderers and rapists and thieves and drug dealers, escaped. We were told that the lawyers, those that fought for our rights, were worse than the thieves who stole from us in the night, that our juries were irresponsible and ignorant and ought not be trusted. We watched with barely more than a mumble as the legal system that once protected us became populated with judges who were appointed by the new king. At last the new king was crowned when we forgot the lessons of history, that when the rights of our enemies have been wrested from them, our own rights have been lost as well. For the same rights serve both citizen and criminal. I understood that my defense of Randy Weaver might attach a legitimacy and dignity to his politics and religion, but I believed that it might as well provide an opportunity to address a more vital issue and stand for the proposition that there are those who do not condone criminal actions by our government. The ultimate enemy of any people is not the angry hate groups that fester within, but a government itself that has lost its respect for the individual. The ultimate enemy of democracy is not the drug dealer or the crooked politician or the crazed skinhead. The ultimate enemy is the new king that has become so powerful it can murder its own citizens with impunity. I believed that of Randy Weaver I would also be required to abandon my belief that this system has any remaining virtue. I would be more at fault than the federal government that committed murder at Ruby Ridge, for I have not been trained to murder, but to defend. I would be less of a man than my client, who had the courage of his convictions. Finally, I would lose all respect for myself. Ronald D. Hohen, the Assistant United States Attorney, a powerful, square-jawed, humorless man, had attempted from the earliest moments of the trial to convict Randy Weaver by tying him to the Aryan nations with slim, circumstantial strings. Everyone knew the Aryan nations as a miserable conglomerate of discontents who, like fanged sheep, followed Pastor Richard Butler of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. Butler preached that what he called the nations were composed of 12 lost tribes of Israel, which were, of course, all white and all cleansed of Jews. Blacks were the descendants of Cain, stricken black in punishment for their inherited sin, and the unfortunate mixtures of blacks and whites Butler ignobly labeled mongrels. The goal of the Aryan nations was twofold. First, the preservation of the white race. Second, the elimination of all Jews, and the confiscation of all property held by Jews, as well as all other non-whites. The cult had often been labeled neo-Nazi, and these so-called skinheads with their shaved skulls, black shirts, and swastikas had gathered at Ruby Ridge to maintain their vigil during the Weaver standoff. Although Colonel Bogreitz had assured me that Randy Weaver was not a member of the Aryan nations, and indeed he was not, Weaver nevertheless had candidly displayed an occasional trapping, and employed from time to time some of their biblical language. It is easy for us to hate these truants from reason who propose ideas that insult the dignity of the species. I too had begun to hate those who were diseased with the disease of hatred. During the trial I had involuntarily become the hero of many whose causes and creeds were antithetical to my own. Yet a pesky voice pestered in my ear that if we do not preserve the right of our enemies to worship and to speak as they please, our own preachments of freedom are as empty cans on the beach. Assistant United States Attorney Ronald D. Hohen was also stricken by the same hatred of hatred, by an enmity that, untethered, could lead to the persecution of people, not for their alleged crimes, but for their loathsome beliefs. I had argued to Judge Edward Lodge that Randy Weaver was not a member of the Aryan nations, for in truth he was flat against belonging to anything, not the NRA, not the PTA, not the Boy Scouts, not even the local garden club. He was a separatist. But I argued that even if he did belong to the Aryan nations, his membership in that or any other organization could not be considered as evidence of his having committed any crime. One is not guilty of murder because one belongs to a church that preaches hatred of one who has been murdered. But Hohen vowed to the judge that he would tie Randy Weaver's beliefs to his actions. Based on that assurance, Judge Lodge permitted evidence to the effect that Randy Weaver and Vicky, his wife, spoke of the coming of Christ, of Armageddon, when the world would be filled with agony and turmoil, and the federal government would be peopled with evil officers who would attack innocent citizens. And Howen was successful as well in dragging before the jury many of the repugnant tenets of the Aryan nations, including their hatred of blacks and Jews. Entwining Randy into the web of guilt by implication, Howen displayed to the jury an Aryan nation's belt buckle, widely sold at gun shows and swap meets, one that Randy supposedly wore. He held up pictures for the jury to see, showing Randy with his hair closely clipped in the style of the skinheads, and thereby he asked the jury to conclude that Randy Weaver must be like the skinheads. He must be one who hates federal officers, who stores up guns and ammunition for the purpose of killing federal officers, and therefore who must have intended to kill Marshal Deegan, or at least plotted to kill him as part of an evil conspiracy. Let me tell you a few of the facts. A crack team of trained government marksmen sneaked onto Randy Weaver's small, isolated acreage on a reconnaissance mission preparatory to a contemplated arrest. They wore camouflage suits and were heavily armed. They gave Randy no warning of their coming. They came without a warrant. They never identified themselves. When the Weaver's dog Stryker discovered the intruders, he raised a ruckus, and Randy, his friend Kevin, and Randy's 14-year-old son, Sammy, grabbed their guns and followed the dog to investigate. When the government agents were confronted with the barking dog, they did what men who have been taught to kill do. They shot Stryker. The boy, barely larger than a 10-year-old child, heard his dog yelp, saw the dog fall, and as a 14-year-old might, he returned the fire. Then the government agents shot the child in the arm. He turned and ran, the arm flopping, and when he did, the officers, still unidentified as such, shot the child in the back and killed him. Kevin Harris witnessed the shooting of the dog. Then he saw Sam being shot as the boy turned and ran. To Kevin Harris, there was no alternative. He knew if he ran, these intruders, whoever they were, would kill him as well. In defense of himself, he raised his rifle and shot in the direction of the officer who had killed the boy. In so doing, he supposedly killed Marshal Deegan. Then, while the agents were in disarray, Kevin retreated to the Weaver cabin. As the trial dragged on, Hohen painted an evil portrait of Randy Weaver, a vicious, wild-eyed radical who had plotted from the beginning, even before he and his family had migrated to Idaho, to instigate a violent confrontation with federal authorities. He had stored up hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition for this purpose, and he owned a score of guns or more, all of which Hohen had hauled into the courtroom and stacked up in a huge pile before the jury. The floor space in front of the jury box looked like the best part of an army ordnance depot by the time the deputies had finished carrying in the evil evidence that the guns and the ammunition had been legally purchased. and when purchased there was no law against Randy Weaver possessing as many guns and as much ammunition as he chose to own. Yet always Randy Weaver denied that he had ever been a member of the Aryan nations. I thought of the story my mother told me as a child about the swan who played with the crows and who was caught one day in the farmer's net along with the crows. The farmer intended to kill the crows because they were eating his corn crop, but the swan begged to be set free. "Obviously, I'm not a crow," the swan argued. "Anyone can see that." But the farmer said, "You must be a crow, for you were caught with the crows." And thereafter the farmer killed all who had been trapped in his net. And so, my mother would counsel, be careful who you choose as friends. During my lifetime, we in America have often endured the invidious reasoning that seeks to prove guilt by associating people with unpopular causes. The internment of innocent and patriotic Japanese in my own home state of Wyoming during World War II. The McCarthy Inquisitions, when decent people were smeared with the taint of communism. The frightening times during the Vietnam War, when good citizens were vilified as traitors, even shot and killed, as at Kent State, should they protest a war with which they disagreed. And after the Oklahoma bombing in April of 1995, we were told that the FBI was investigating individuals as bombing suspects. That included such circumstances as, quote, the suspect would make remarks, like how we were losing our freedom, end quote, which would likely qualify every thinking, peace-loving American as a bombing suspect. And, quote, the suspect liked to wear military fatigues, was anti-government, and had a fascination with firearms, end quote, which could cast millions into the irredeemable trough of suspicion. I had grown up believing the police were just good people like Andy Setka, the policeman who lived next door, and who my parents told me would come to find me when I was lost, and who would help me when I needed help. I never saw Andy Setka without a big smile on his face, and I saw him every day, and his kids were my pals. We all have our primary experiences by which we judge the people and the events of our lives. As I grew older, I naturally thought of the police, yes, even the federal police, as folks like Andy Setka. They were decent folks who lived next door to decent folks. They were trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly. They were adult Boy Scouts who carried a badge and a sidearm. But over the years, as a criminal defense attorney, my in-court experiences with the police forced me to the realization that police, like the rest of us, are competitive people. They want to win. Many police, perhaps most, struggle under the misguided belief that when the accused is guilty, it becomes the duty of the police to see that the accused is convicted and punished. Many police seem to weigh one wrong against the other, their own wrong of fiddling with the evidence, of intentionally omitting exculpatory facts, even the criminal wrong of planting or manufacturing evidence, or equally reprehensible, lying under oath. These are weighed against what many police see as the greater wrong of permitting the guilty to escape his just dues. Indeed, the argument that it is all right for the police to cheat, if in the process they catch the criminal, is commonly dramatized in the movies and on the television screen. This idea, in fact, is applauded by many a citizen as justice in the raw, without all the bothersome loopholes that permit the guilty to escape. On the screen, we often witness the cop blithely picking the lock of a suspect's home and illegally entering and searching his room. We watch the illegal phone tap being made, or the cop, the hero, smashing a witness up against the wall and brutally pounding information out of the hapless creature, and we cheer him on. At the same time, many years in the courtroom have taught me that most police officers cannot withstand a powerful, well-prepared cross-examination. Often they react. Often they display their anger. Sometimes they reveal a dark underside, and then juries will reject their testimony. A good cross-examination can usually expose the holes in their investigation, their errors, perhaps even their wrongdoing. The police, as I have grown to know them in the hard, tough world of the courtroom, are far different from the Andy Setkas of my childhood. The police have become fair game, and indeed they ought to be. Were it otherwise, we would need no laws, no rules, no trials, no juries. The police, as in every police state, would simply level their charges and lead the defendant to his blindfolded stance before the firing squad. During Randy Weaver's trial, an agony for him that endured for nearly 3 months, I found the minions of the law, the special agents of the FBI, to be men who proved themselves not only fully capable of manufacturing, but also utterly willing to manufacture evidence, to conceal crucial evidence, and even to change the rules that governed life and death if, in the prosecution of the accused, it seemed expedient to do so. Even after all of these years, it hurt me to see it. It still hurts me to say it. As the case lumbered forward under the methodical strategy of Ronald Hohen, and as our cross-examinations took their toll, it became clear that the FBI had no direct evidence that would tie Randy Weaver physically to the Y. That was the now infamous fork in the faint trail through the trees where the dog, Stryker, Old Yellow we called him during the trial, and Little Sam, and Marshall Deegan all lost their lives. The truth was virtually undeniable. Randy Weaver had not been at the Y at the time of the shooting. When Old Yellow barking took off on the trail after something, Randy had not followed the boys who were hot after Old Yellow. Instead, he had run in another direction to see if he could cut off the bear or the deer. Everyone thought the dog was trailing. Some time later, Randy heard the shots, and that's when he had called out to Sammy. "Come on home, Sammy. Come on home, son." He heard the boy call back, "I'm coming, Dad." And those were the last words he ever heard from his son. Kevin Harris told the same story. Randy had not been at the Y. Later, the kids told how their father had arrived home ahead of the others, and how Kevin Harris came plodding back to the house as the agonized bearer of the news that Sammy had been killed. Randy then broke into wild sobbing, rolled on the ground, and beat the earth. Finally, he grabbed his rifle and shot it into the air, emptied it and loaded it again, time after time, and when he was exhausted, it was Vicky, the source of the family's power, and the only person Randy would listen to, who was, at last, able to restrain him. The marshals had been repeatedly admonished by Washington not to engage the Weavers, and at all costs not to injure one of the Weaver children. But now they had killed this small boy, shot him in the back. What should they do? At the trial, they claimed they didn't know they had shot the boy, that he must have fallen out of their sight. Yet, as I argued at the trial, they could not have twice shot the child without first seeing him, and considering his fatal wound through the back, he must have fallen right where he was shot. And when later, the same day, Vicky and Randy and Kevin Harris plodded down to the Y to retrieve the body of little Sammy, the marshals, hidden in the trees where they had fired on the dog and the boy in the first place, must have heard their wailing. Had they looked where they shot, they must have seen this weeping mother and this broken father lift up their child, whose wounded arm was dangling by the hide like so much red jerky hung out to dry. And after that, they must have seen these three struggle around the bend and disappear out of sight as they headed home, bearing their dead. Rather than go on down and confess to the world what had happened, the marshals stayed huddled in the woods until dark, claiming they were surrounded by these crazies, these Weavers. Then, under cover of night, the marshals dispatched 2 of their 6 to their staging station below to report to the local sheriff that the marshals had been engaged in a horrendous firefight in which they had taken as many as 1,000 rounds of fire from the Weavers. They said that Officer Deegan had been murdered in the firefight, that the Weavers were heavily armed, zealous and extremely dangerous, and that they had vowed they would never be taken alive. They further added that the marshals were surrounded and required immediate reinforcements. A similar message was dispatched to the marshals' Washington headquarters and thereafter to the FBI. Almost immediately, the FBI dispersed its hostage rescue team to Rupi Ridge to save the embattled marshals and to put down these lunatic cultists who had them surrounded. Not satisfied with this initial report, the marshals the next day supplied an affidavit to the court that blatantly, falsely, stated that the Weavers had been shooting at the marshals from a pickup truck. And what about this supposed firefight in which the marshals took as many as 1,000 live rounds from the Weavers? During the trial, the most favorable evidence the FBI could provide was that from both sides, a total of 19 rounds had been fired. The marshals fired 14 rounds, while Kevin and Sammy fired 5. But the myth of a massive firefight persisted, and the myth was obediently recounted by the marshals at trial, because one would surmise that if there had been a firefight, well, perhaps it would go a long way in explaining how the marshals came to shoot in the back both a dog and a small boy running home. The public believes that the police enforce an unwritten code that provides an effective and summary punishment for any who have killed a police officer. People believe that it is far more serious for a citizen to kill a human being who wears a badge than to kill one who does not. The penalty imposed by the police on the cop killer is, of course, death. During the trial, certain facts and circumstances were revealed which, in several camps, argued strongly for the proposition that federal police officers undertook to execute this unwritten rule against the Weavers at Ruby Ridge in retaliation for the death of Marshal Deegan. Let me explain. During the trial, the marshals told how in April of 1992, long before the tragic incident at the Y, the marshals had set up solar-powered microwave video cameras from 2 positions and at some distance from the Weaver homestead. From these surveillance cameras, the marshals had retrieved hundreds of hours of film that provided the marshals' task force with, as they described it, crucial intelligence information as to what occurs on the compound daily. These videos showed that whenever the Weavers came out of the house, even a trip to the outhouse, they carried their rifles. The cameras showed that when the dogs barked, when vehicles happened by, whenever there were strangers approaching, whenever the Weavers came out to investigate any goings-on, they carried their rifles, even the kids. But in the tradition of the Western gun handler, Randy Weaver had taught his family that no one ever points a gun at another unless one intends to kill that person. Not once did a member of the Weaver family put a gun on any stranger who happened by, or on any marshal, or on any other law enforcement officer. From time to time, many people had stopped by the Weaver place, some to seek information about the availability of nearby land, some to ask directions, and some just to talk. After cautious inquiry, the Weavers proved to be friendly, even inviting some of the folks to come into the house for cookies. Indeed, more than one of the strangers who happened by as suspected by the Weavers were federal marshals, looking in on the Weavers as they prepared their strategies to arrest Randy and to bring him down. The day following the shooting of Marshal Deegan, whom the jury later found had been shot by Kevin Harris in self-defense, we see from the testimony the Associate Director of the Marshal Service, one Duke Smith, and the leader of the FBI hostage rescue team, one Richard Rogers, being flown from Washington to Ruby Ridge, where they would soon take on this, quote, crazy skinhead, end quote, Randy Weaver, and his equally, quote, crazy skinhead family, end quote. According to the testimony, the 2 men were agreeing on a new shoot-on-sight rule of engagement. Now, a rule of engagement is a euphemism for the authority under which officers are authorized to kill citizens. Under common law, as under the laws of all 50 states, one can intentionally kill another only in self-defense, and then only if one reasonably believes that he or a third person is in imminent peril of death or serious bodily harm. This, too, was the essence of the FBI's traditional rule of engagement, as set out in its own regulations in plain, easy English, a rule by which the FBI and its hostage rescue team were fully bound. But now we see Rogers had changed that rule. As they flew over the broad, flat plains toward the mountains of Idaho, the law of the land was changed into a simple order to kill. This new rule was no longer the law of self-defense. Instead, it now read that FBI snipers, bearing their heavy target rifles with their 10-power scopes that can put a bullet into a pea at 200 yards, could and should kill any adult at the so-called Weaver compound who was armed, whether that person was threatening with a gun or not. Thus, when Randy or Kevin, yes, when even Vicky innocently walked to the outhouse carrying their rifles, they were dead. Thus, when they ran out to see who had just driven up, as was their well-known habit, and they carried their rifles, which was also their well-known habit, they were dead. The officers who decreed into life this new death-dealing rule of engagement must have known from the hundreds of hours of surveillance films the marshals had previously collected that whenever the Weavers left the house, they were always armed. The result of the new rule was that all of the adults at the Weaver house would now be shot, thus eliminating the troublesome Weaver problem once and for all, and in effect executing the well-known unwritten penalty imposed by cops against any who kill a cop. Contemplate the enormity of the power of these two men from separate federal agencies as they changed the law of the land and, according to Eugene Glenn, on-site commander at Ruby Ridge, did so with the full knowledge and consent of Larry Potts, the assistant director of the FBI in Washington. From the evidence as we gathered it from our cross-examination, we watched Rogers change the law in the same way that any tyrant rules, by decree, by bald, secret order, by overt edict, without the consent, yes, without even the knowledge of the people. Rogers, with the power to command those who are trained to kill, and who are willing to kill, and who have at their disposal countless instruments of death, thus deployed such men and such instruments under these new death warrant rules of engagement. It is the rule of law that has for centuries protected us from the hoodlum, the gun-happy, and the vindictive cop. The rule of law, enacted by a duly elected and convened legislative body, is the mark of the enlightened civilization that distinguishes us from all lower forms of government that have historically enslaved the species. As Smith and Rogers flew to Ruby Ridge, the Weavers were unaware that the rule of law had been aborted, and that within hours the FBI would set up its trap, the fulcrum of which would be this new shoot-on-sight rule of engagement. Before the day was over, this new rule would account for the killing of Vicki Weaver and the wounding of all of the males still alive at the Weaver homestead. We were told that before the killing of Vicki Weaver, the new rule of engagement had been amended to read that the officers could and should shoot any armed male, as distinguished from the original language, any armed adult who presented himself or herself at the Weaver compound. But the claim that there was such an amendment made before Vicki was shot is, in my opinion, suspect. For not only was the original order to shoot any armed adult, which of course included Vicki, but it was Vicki who indeed was thus killed. For it was Vicki who from the beginning had been cast by the marshals in the role of the leader, the brains, the heart and soul of the Weaver clan, it having been the marshals' conclusion that none of the Weavers would ever surrender so long as Vicki was alive. After the shooting, and after it became clear that the sniper Lon Horiuchi, lead man on the FBI hostage rescue team, had killed an unarmed mother holding her baby, and considering the fact that no one held a warrant for Vicki's arrest, it seems more than likely that the new rule of engagement was amended after the murder of Vicki Weaver to provide for the killing of only armed males. Without such an amendment, how else could the officers convincingly contend that Vicki Weaver's death had been just a tragic mistake? By the time Smith and Rogers arrived at Ruby Ridge, something was obviously amiss. At the scene, there was no firefight. That was plain to see. All was silent except for the heavy rumble of armored personnel carriers, tanks of a kind, and the popping propellers of helicopters, and the hollering of hundreds of uniformed men setting up their tents and packing their knapsacks, and cleaning their pieces, and preparing their equipment for war. Unbeknown to the Weavers, and under the cover of darkness, the FBI spread its hostage rescue team across the way in positions that were unobservable to the Weavers. 6 skilled sharpshooters with their sniper guns resting, ready for the kill, along with 6 observers. The FBI had made no demand that the Weavers surrender before the officers were to fire, nor had anyone even hinted to the Weavers that 6 sniper teams waited with their eyes pushed up against their scopes, ready to kill any armed male who walked out the front door. Then Randy and his 16-year-old daughter Sarah and their friend Kevin Harris stepped out, their guns pointed at no one. They were as innocent as small forest animals walking into the jaws of the steel trap. They strolled slowly toward the birthing shed where Randy and Vicki had lain the body of Sammy the day before. Their mission was one of grief, not of hostility. In their injured hearts, they suffered the need to see their beloved Sammy one last time before they buried him, to say goodbye. Then, as Randy slowly walked up to the birthing shed and reached up to open the homemade latch, Lon Horiuchi opened fire. Horiuchi's bullet struck Randy through the soft part of his underarm, leaving a neat, round hole the size of a lead pencil. "I'm hit," Randy hollered, and when Sarah saw that her father was alive but stunned, she jumped in behind him and began pushing him out ahead of her. They had run, the three of them, Kevin in the rear, toward the house. They had run with their backs to the snipers. And under my cross-examination, Horiuchi admitted that he was trying to kill the running Harris. For was not Horiuchi a sniper trained to kill? Committed to kill, in accordance with the new rule of engagement? And Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris, weren't they armed? More than that, Horiuchi admitted he believed it was Harris, not Weaver, whom he had shot in the first place, although Weaver stands about 5'7" and Harris stands well over 6 feet tall. And at the door, of course, stood Vicky, armed only with her 10-month-old child, Elisheba, at her breast. "I'm hit, Mama," Randy had cried to Vicky as he ran toward the door that Vicky had been holding open for him. "I'm hit." "Get in here," Vicky shouted. And those were her last words. We know the rest. Horiuchi's bullet smashed into her head and blew off the side of her face. And after she fell, Randy pried the baby from her hands, and Randy and Sarah dragged the body of their slain wife and mother over to the side of the kitchen where she lay, her blood flooding the kitchen floor. Sarah spread a blanket over her dead mother. And after that, the body lay there for many days in the hot August air, rotting before the sight of the children, before the small child Rachel, the crying baby, and Sarah huddled with her father, waiting to be killed. And in the other room, Kevin Harris lay slowly dying of his chest wounds from the same bullet that had killed Vicky, and sometimes he begged Randy to kill him, to take his gun and to shoot him in the head, to stop the unbearable agony. In the meantime, the FBI sent agents who crawled under the house and stuck listening devices under the floor. And although Randy many times screamed out to the officers that they had killed his wife, the officers pretended that they did not know she was dead, and they mercilessly taunted the family. "Did you sleep well last night, Vicky?" And "Show us the baby, Vicky." And "What did you have for breakfast, Vicky?" "We had pancakes." And on it went. And the officers placed a robot on the front porch that was equipped with a sawed-off shotgun, and the FBI approached the Weaver house only in an armored personnel carrier. And the FBI brought up its negotiator, who spoke to the Weavers over a bullhorn. The FBI kept spotlights on the small house all night and played loud music so the people inside couldn't sleep. And the FBI tried to drive the people, if not out of the house, then out of their minds. Perhaps by now we have forgotten why Randy Weaver wouldn't come down to be arrested in the first place. He was not a criminal. He had never even collected a speeding ticket during his lifetime. He had been honorably discharged from the Army, collecting a number of meritorious citations. But he had principles, old-fashioned principles, like a belief that a man becomes what a man does, which of course made it quite impossible for him to become a snitch for the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents. We remember that an agent for the ATF, for our government, had talked this thoroughly peace-loving man into sawing off a shotgun for money. And once having talked him into it, the ATF sprung its infamous trap. The agents demanded that Randy snitch for them, or else they'd charge him with a gun violation and send him to prison. Predictably, Randy told them to go to hell, that he was not going to become a snitch by snitching, a liar by lying, and he was not going to become one who betrays those who trust him by betraying those who trust him. He would not. And it was after that that the ATF had set out to arrest him and bring him down from Ruby Ridge. The ATF had dawdled around for 18 months before they finally decided to bring him in. The ATF chose a winter day when Randy and Vicky had set out in their old pickup to fetch some supplies. The marshal's strategy was simple. They parked an old pickup camper on a bridge as if it were stalled. Inside the pickup, several heavily armed marshals waited, guns at ready, and another marshal had taken a strategic position above the bridge, where he lay in wait in his white camouflage suit, his machine gun leveled on the scene below. When Randy and Vicky drove up, a man and a woman, both marshals, both dressed in humble country clothes, were peering under the hood. Randy walked up to see if he could help. At that moment, the officers emerged from the back of the camper, guns drawn, and put him to the ground. Vicky, too, was thrown to the ground. That night, the officers threw Randy in jail, and Vicky was released to drive home alone. The next day, Randy was taken before Magistrate Stephen Ayres, who, at the trial, testified that he had released Weaver on his own bond. Under the relentless cross-examination of Chuck Peterson, our associate, the magistrate admitted that he told Weaver that if Weaver appeared for trial and if he lost, he might lose his house, the family's major asset. That was a fearsome message Randy and Vicky would never forget. Magistrate Ayres also admitted he had misadvised Randy as to the law in this matter, but Magistrate Ayres never corrected the error. Faced with the fear of losing their home if Randy lost his case, Randy and Vicky began to ask simple questions. How could Randy ever win the case? He had sawed off the shotgun, hadn't he? And that was illegal, was it not? And the feds had him cold on audio tape when he sold the sawed-off shotgun to the undercover ATF agent. Neither Randy nor Vicky were versed in the sophisticated law of entrapment. As they saw it, if Randy lost the case, the government would take the family's home, and where would the family go then? And if they were homeless, the government would probably take the kids from them as well. As the facts and the law was presented to them, they had no alternative but to stay where they were and to pray.
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn over the tape for proper cueing of Side 2.